For the third time in my relatively short life, Israel has invaded my country. This time, they're very clear that they want to create a long-term occupation in the south of Lebanon, which of course would not be the first time. A lot of people have recently been publishing timelines of Israeli invasions and aggressions on Lebanon to demonstrate this. These timelines usually focus on the major flashpoints, like the 1982 or 2006 invasions, but I think that makes them fall short of demonstrating the real breadth and continuity of Israel's violent obsession with Lebanon. Beyond that, Lebanon's encounter with Zionism goes much further back than most know, even predating the establishment of the State of Israel itself. A telling example is that in 1941, during the Second World War, Zionist militias accompanied British forces in invading Lebanese territory, then controlled by Vichy France. It was in one of these battles that a Zionist militiaman was injured by the bullet of a Vichy rifle, resulting in the loss of his left eye. That man was Moshe Dayan, who, in my book, is one of the most evil-looking men in history. And no, it's not just because of the eye patch, but because I know what he's done, and I can't not project that onto his face. You see, Moshe Dayan was an early Zionist leader, himself born to settler parents in Palestine, originally from Ukraine, in 1915, and was basically present in every major landmark event of the Zionist colonization of Palestine. He joined the Haganah, which was a Zionist militia in Mandatory Palestine. He was involved in crushing the Palestinian Revolt of 1936, and fought in the 1948 war and expelled swaths of Palestinians during the Nakba. From the 50s until his death in 1981, he first moved between high-level positions within the military and then within successive Israeli governments, most notably as Minister of Defense in the late 60s. I'm making a point of mentioning Dayan because he kind of encapsulates a lot about the state of Israel. Have you, for instance, ever heard someone describe Israel as basically just a military that became a state? Well, that's Moshe Dayan, isn't it? But also, there are so many quotes attributed to Moshe Dayan that reveal an incredible amount of self-awareness about what he and his Zionist colleagues were doing. As in, he's one of those early Zionist leaders whose quotes are just so revealing and cut right through so much Zionist propaganda we hear over and over today. I don't know if you're familiar with this genre, but here's one example of him describing the very foundation of the State of Israel. We came to this country, which is already populated by Arabs, and we are establishing a Hebrew, that is, a Jewish state here. Jewish villages were built in the place of Arab villages. You do not even know the names of these Arab villages, and I do not blame you, because the geography books no longer exist. Not only do the books not exist, the Arab villages are not there either. There is not one place built in this country that did not have a former Arab population. But for those that know the history of Palestine and its encounter with Zionism, that story is very familiar. It's just notable that it's coming from a Zionist leader, from the horse's mouth, if you will. But Dayan also has other quotes that reveal parts of the history that are a bit more obscure, parts that are muddied by the focus on the major flashpoints, like the Nakba or the Six-Day War. For instance, in the early 50s, when he was a commander of the Southern Command, he developed a policy of dealing with what they called infiltrators, that is, expelled Palestinians, either trying to return home, trying to collect things that were left behind when they were forced off their land, or not yet organized Fedayeen militants who would infiltrate and carry out operations in the nascent state. This is how he described his policy. Retaliation is the only method that has proved effective. Not justified or moral, but effective, when Arabs plant mines on our side. If we try to search for that Arab, it has no value. But if we harass the nearby village, then the population there comes out against the infiltrators. The method of collective punishment so far has proved effective. There are no other effective methods. There is, of course, another word for that: terrorism, or another, war crime. But then again, this is Israel we're talking about, so color me shocked. This quote also reveals a history that is often forgotten, the in-between periods of the major ruptures. Between 1949 and 1956, there were tens of thousands of these infiltrations every single year, and there were hundreds of bloody retaliatory raids by the Israelis in other parts of Palestine, specifically Gaza and the West Bank, in Jordan, and also in Lebanon. To put an end to the returnees and attacks from the north, Moshe Dayan, in 1955, then Chief of Staff, proposed a plan that shocked even his Prime Minister, Moshe Sharet, to annex southern Lebanon. All that is required is to find an officer, even a captain would do, to win his heart or buy him with money, to get him to agree to declare himself the savior of the Maronite population. Then, the Israeli army will enter Lebanon, occupy the necessary territory, and create a Christian regime that will ally itself with Israel. The territory from the Litani southward will be totally annexed to Israel, and everything will fall into place. This is precisely what the Israelis will do 23 years later in 1978, while Dayan himself was foreign minister. And just to top this all off, here's one final quote by Moshe Dayan from 1974, which is as succinct and murderous as they come. "We will make all life impossible in South Lebanon."
Wanted to say it in a very clear way, that if we cannot live at peace on our side, then eventually the entire southern part of Lebanon won't be able to live there. Eventually, a good part of Lebanon will be destroyed and deserted.
That is as clear as it gets, and I can't help but see the parallels with what the Israelis are saying today. We are 2.5 years into the genocide in Gaza, where we've heard phrases like this over and over again. And now, increasingly, we're hearing them about Lebanon too. And of course, it's not all talk. Since the 2nd of March, Israel has displaced over 1 million people in Lebanon, claiming that they will never be allowed to return. They've destroyed entire villages, invaded the country with ground troops, destroyed hospitals and schools, killed entire families, medics, journalists, and academics. All these put together spell out one word: genocide. Their main target, Shia Lebanese. And fully backed by the United States, Israel is enacting its genocide in Lebanon with full force. God, it pains me so much to say those words together. But at this point, even the Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention has issued 2 red flag warnings for genocide in Lebanon. But while I acknowledge this is a new situation, the roots of it run deep. For instance, a lot of people blame Hezbollah for starting this war. The Lebanese Prime Minister Nawaf Salam and President Joseph Aoun continuously refer to this as other people's war, being fought on Lebanese soil. But I don't see it, and I think the history makes that very clear. I'm not saying Hezbollah doesn't have any agency in the matter, or doesn't bear any responsibility, but that really is not the whole picture. It's an incredibly uncomfortable fact to have to reckon with, but this war is imposed on us. And it is, in fact, a long war, not one that started on March the 2nd or October the 8th, 2024, not even in 1982, but one that stretches far back to the very introduction of Zionism in the region. So what I'm going to do is demonstrate that long and continuous war. Show that Israel has always seen Lebanon's sovereignty as a threat, and that ultimately Israel is trying to destroy Lebanon as a whole. They've been doing this through their countrywide bombing campaigns, by their invasion and occupation of the south, but also by fomenting civil war in Lebanon, which ultimately would still serve their aim of fundamentally weakening the Lebanese state. There is no ability for us to simply opt out of the war. To understand any of this, we first have to examine the joint history of Lebanon and Zionism. But before I get into any of that, hello. Welcome to another one of my videos. If you like this video, if you like the work I've been doing, then please consider supporting me so I can continue doing this and make more videos. The best way to do that is to become a member of my Patreon. Not only will you be able to support me by becoming a member, but you'll also get a few select perks, depending on the membership tier. If you can't become a monthly paying member, then you can give me a one-time donation in my tip jar. Both links will be in the description below. And so, with that said, on with the video. Part 1. A joint history of the Lebanese and Zionist entities. I know some of you might be confused by the term, the Lebanese entity. The term is not made to equate it with the Zionist entity and its origins, but rather it stems from an analysis of the formation of the State of Lebanon, specifically one that recognizes the colonial relations that formed it and its many structural and exclusionary flaws. It is these aspects that also make Lebanon particularly vulnerable to exploitation and manipulation by the Israelis, as well as other regional powers, and has basically kept Lebanon in a state of perpetual crisis since its foundation. So what I'm going to do in this section is outline a thematic and chronological history of the two entities and show how they intersect. To do that, I've decided to create my own timeline, which not only includes events that are all too often ignored in the other timelines that I mentioned earlier, but also includes more than just Israeli invasions and aggressions on Lebanon. I include in the timeline key regional events that I think are essential in understanding this history. The chart is free to download if you want a better look at it, with the link in the description below. What I hope comes across through this timeline is that what Lebanon is experiencing today has less to do with Hezbollah or the Iran war or even the presence of Palestinian resistance in Lebanon, but is in reality the culmination of decades of continuous assault by the State of Israel of our very sovereignty. To demonstrate that continuity, I'm going to have 3 counters above my head while going through this chart and the history. These will be things that, when you look at the history, make repeated appearances over and over again, and that you've probably heard a lot about these days. These counters will be the Litani River, buffer zone, and ceasefire. So I've chosen to start the timeline in the midst of the First World War. The first major thing here is the secretly drawn up Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was one of the classic white men carving up indigenous land in Asia kind of things. The region the two colonial powers carved up was known for centuries, and still to this day, as Bilad al-Sham, which is often translated as the Levant, but more closely translates to the land of the left. Basically, if the Arab Hijaz is the center, looking eastwards towards the sun, then to your left is Bilad al-Sham, and to your right is Yemen, from the Arabic word yamin, which is actually also where my name comes from. But yes, for hundreds of years at a time, Bilad al-Sham passed hands to numerous rulers. And then, for the first time since the Crusades, European forces conquered the land in 1918. This is where our story really begins. In 1920, France, alongside local Maronite Christian elites in Mount Lebanon, created what is known as Greater Lebanon, a colonial state under French supervision. It's always been a bit confusing that it was called Greater Lebanon, because if you look at it on a map, it looks a lot like, well, Lebanon. The reason for this is that before the creation of this state, the name Lebanon referred to the Mount Lebanon range. This is actually also why older people, specifically British people, often still call Lebanon the Lebanon, like the Ukraine or the Gambia. It's because the name referred to a specific geographical location as opposed to a state. Greater Lebanon was an expansion of Mount Lebanon to include areas around it, specifically the coastal cities of Beirut, Saida, and Tripoli, Akkar to its north, the Ba'a to its east, and Jabal Amel to its south. The main objective here was to separate Lebanon from Syria and the rest of Bilad al-Sham, and to create a viable state that was led by a majority Christian Maronite population, which was very friendly to the French. Annexing those other territories ensured enough farmland, access to ports, and surplus populations for this new state. It also meant access to key water sources, such as the Litani River. One of the best, most concise descriptions of this state comes from the British historian Patrick Seal. Greater Lebanon was intended as a haven for the predominant Maronite community, France's main client. But in terms of geopolitics, it was also conceived as a French fortress in the eastern Mediterranean, which could be used against European rivals as well as against Arab nationalists of the Syrian interior. This is the origin of the Lebanese entity, a Maronite Christian state built to advance France's strategic interests in the region. During this exact period, another ethno-state was slowly being formed to the south of the country. But instead of allying with an existing community, the British opted for settler colonialism and sought to make the European Zionists the dominant force within Palestine. The absolute contempt that these white colonial Europeans had for indigenous peoples was clear, not just in these actions, but also in their words. A notorious example of this was a quote attributed to Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of the UK, who said in reference to objections to using the new technology of aerial bombardments against civilian populations, that we must reserve the right to bomb, So these were the people who were now in charge in Palestine. At that point, though, Zionist colonists had already been settling in Palestine for almost 40 years, although very slowly. With support of the British, that migration began to increase dramatically, and it soon became evident to the local Palestinian population that the British were giving favorable treatment to the new European Jewish communities. Here are two interesting maps drawn up at the time. One that broadly depicts the future state of Israel without any defined borders, which includes Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, and parts of Syria. Just to note, those red lines are actually train lines. There are no borders on this map. However, this second map from 1920 does show borders, specifically the northern border of the future state. You see three lines, one which is the Sykes-Picot line, the second is a suggested border which shoots right into southern Lebanon, and then a maximum demand border, which engulfs all the territory south of and including the Litani River. Now, not a lot of people know this, but Sykes-Picot wasn't the final agreement between the French and the British. In 1923, the two powers drafted another, more detailed agreement known as the Paulet-Newcomb Agreement. This agreement more accurately defined the borders between Mandatory Lebanon and Palestine. It moved the borders between these two states, and most notably placed several Lebanese villages under the authority of the British Mandate. In total, 20 Lebanese villages were seized by Britain. Three notable ones were Malakiya, Salha, and Hunin, all of which were inhabited by Shia Muslims. Over the next 20 years, the main two conflicting tendencies in the region is the continued colonization of Bilad al-Sham and the continued resistance to that colonization. The largest effort in this period to resist this colonial process was the 1936 to 1939 Great Palestinian Revolt. Through tremendous amounts of violence, the British, alongside Jewish settler militias such as the Haganah, crushed the revolt and expelled its surviving leaders to neighboring countries. The rebellion was so powerful that in order to crush it, the British stationed more troops in Palestine than they had in the entire Indian subcontinent. In the following years, the region was gripped by war. It was one of the theaters of World War II between the European powers. Actually, as a fun fact, one of the few times during the war that the British and French fought each other directly was in Lebanon. It was during this period that Jewish militiamen in Palestine, like Moshe Dayan, were armed and trained by Allied forces, which ultimately made them far more well-equipped than actual national armies in the region. In the midst of the war, in 1943, after the Vichy government was defeated in Lebanon, Lebanese elites declared independence from France. But to be clear, it wasn't a bitter breakup. Lebanon would still maintain a very friendly relationship with the French. The reasons and effects of this I'll get to in a minute. But sticking with the timeline, it is just after the end of World War II that Zionist militias step up their own campaign for independence in Palestine. They did so by engaging in terrorist attacks against the British, most notably the 1946 King David Hotel bombing.
Jerusalem has long been the focal point of the still unsolved problem of Palestine. And the result of the crime, the tragic scene, is like a serious incident during the Blitz. The hotel housed the British Army headquarters and the Palestine government offices, and casualties were very heavy.
So by May 1948, when the British Mandate of Palestine was set to expire, the British were all too eager to wipe their hands clean of the conflict they were instrumental in creating. All of this leads to the 1948 moment, known to Arabs as the Nakba, the catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians are expelled from Palestine, with at least 100,000 heading to Lebanon. Here, it's important to note that those villages I mentioned earlier, Malakiya, Salha, and Hunin, were among the destroyed villages whose populations were expelled into Lebanon. In the war that ensued, known as the First Arab-Israeli War, Lebanon did participate, although very little. In most locations, even within Lebanese territory, the Lebanese army withdrew, refusing to fight the Zionists. The only town that did see resistance from the Lebanese army was Malakiya, which, as I mentioned earlier, was a Lebanese village with a predominantly Shia population that was placed into British-occupied Palestine. The Lebanese army successfully fended off assault after assault in Malakiya, lost the town, recaptured it, and demonstrated that fighting back was possible. It was only after intense international pressure that the Lebanese army withdrew from Malakiya. Ever since, an Israeli kibbutz stands in its place. Zionist forces also carried out attacks in southern Lebanon, most notably during Operation Hicham. Not only did they invade the country, but they also committed numerous massacres against Lebanese civilians, such as the Hula massacre in November 1948, in which approximately 60 civilians were killed. Their forces reached deep into Lebanese territory, at its height reaching the Litani River. All of this ends in 1949, when Lebanon agrees to an armistice with the State of Israel, which brings us our first ceasefire. The state that was founded through this ethnic cleansing would go on to be an expansionist, ethno-nationalist, armed garrison state. This, I think, is clear to a lot of people today. But what's less clear is the nature of the State of Lebanon. The defining and most unique feature of the Lebanese entity is the political system of sectarianism. In 1943, the ruling Christian Maronite and Sunni Muslim elite drafted something known as the National Pact, which stipulated that Lebanon should have a Maronite Christian president, a Sunni Muslim prime minister, and a Shia Muslim Speaker of the House. An agreement that still remains to this day. Now here I have to be very clear. It is a mistake to think that Lebanon has the sectarian system it does because of the nature of its many religious communities. That is, that the sectarian system is simply an organic and natural expression of the sectarian divisions in the country. No, it is a system of choice that enabled the local elite from the main sects, with the Maronite elite on top, to become mediators between the colonial powers, namely France, and local populations. The most concise and I think powerful description of the system was by the Lebanese Marxist intellectual Mahdi Amel, who described it as such. Sectarianism is the particular historical form of the political system through which the Lebanese colonial bourgeoisie exercises its class dominance within a relation of structural dependency on imperialism. I know that might sound like Marxist word soup to some of you, but honestly, it's so precise and cuts through so much obfuscation of the sectarian system in Lebanon. In a macro sense, the system means that different posts in the Lebanese state are designated and divided amongst the sectarian elite, be them Christian or Muslim. That elite politics meant continued access to European finance, which would later form the backbone of Lebanon's economy to the detriment of local productive economic activities like industry and agriculture. At a micro level, at the everyday, it means that we, as citizens, only exist to the state as a member of one sect or another. When I vote in elections, I have to go to my father's village, and I can only vote for either Druze or Christian candidates, because they're the main inhabitants of my area. I don't exist as a citizen, as Ayman, but as a Druze from a specific area, So it goes individual, sect, state. It's a ridiculous system, one that has created so many disasters, and one that I consider somewhat similar to the current system in the state of Israel, where citizenship doesn't exist. People are seen by the state through their ethnicity. And ultimately, it's a system that essentially disenfranchises the vast majority of people, and is thus not representative. The sectarian system in Lebanon went through several crises in the 50s and 60s, but the greatest threat to its existence came a decade later, in the form of the Lebanese national movement of the 1970s. You see, the sectarian system could have theoretically worked, except for three main things. One, the existence in Lebanon of an entire sect, predominantly of agricultural communities in the south and east, who had basically no representation within the sectarian or oligarchical system, namely the Shia. These communities also took a huge economic blow following the creation of the State of Israel, as their economy relied heavily on trade with Palestinian villages and cities. 2. The fact that the main divisions between people were not based on sect or religion, but by class, and that the sectarian elite had no serious plan to deal with the contradictions of colonial or capitalist class divisions, let alone feudal divisions, which very much still existed. Mahdi Amel combines these two into one major obstacle that he spells out in the same text I quoted earlier. The foremost obstacle was the mass of toilers who belong to the downtrodden sects and live either in the countryside or in the clutches of poverty in the capital. As their voices were raised, so did their acts of resistance. They demanded the system be changed, whether by putting an end to sectarian hegemony without destroying the system itself, or by putting an end to the system entirely. And the third major obstacle to the system was the introduction to Lebanon of some 100,000 plus Palestinian refugees, who were predominantly Sunni Muslim. Not only did this totally mess up the precious demographic balance within the country, but also forced Lebanon into reckoning with the fact that it is not an island separate from the rest of the region. Almost immediately after their expulsion, unorganized Palestinian Fedayeen militants began carrying out operations against the nascent Jewish state, built on the ruins of their homeland. In Lebanon, the army moved quickly to quell these attacks and returnees, fearing Israeli attacks on their territory. They did so by essentially placing Palestinian refugee camps under martial law.
أن نذكر أو نتذكر بأنه سبقها فترة حكم عرفي خضعت له المخيمات من عام 59 حتى عام 69. وفي ظل هذه الأحكام العرفية اتخذت إجراءات ضد الفلسطينيين غير معقولة ولم تكن منطقية ولم تكن سائدة في المنطقة العربية، من نوع أنه الانتقال من مخيم لمخيم يجب أن يتم بتصريح، علما أن المسافة بين مخيم ومخيم لا تزيد عن نصف ساعة مشيا على الأقدام ببعض المخيمات. الانتقال من منطقة لمنطقة يجب أن يحصل صاحبه أو المنتقل منطقة لمنطقة على تصريح من قيادة الجيش. ممنوع قراءة الجريدة بالمحلات العامة، ممنوع استمرار السهر لأكثر من الساعة 10 ليلا إلى آخره من الإجراءات.
This was also the exact context in which Moshe Dayan made the statement I shared at the beginning about annexing Lebanon up until the Litani River. But they didn't have to do that, as the Lebanese army proved to be quite effective in preventing those operations from taking place to begin with. Aside from that, Israel was preoccupied elsewhere, most notably against Egypt, Syria, and the Palestinian territories they failed to capture in 1948. There are a few key events that lead to the Israelis focusing more on Lebanon. First was the Palestinian Revolution of 1965. Basically, this was the creation of Fatah, the first serious attempt for Palestinians in exile to unify and organize around armed struggle. The largest organization amongst them was the PLO, which at the time was mainly based in Jordan but had a strong presence in Lebanon as well. The next major thing was the defeat of the Arab armies in 1967, and with it, the crushing of the hopes that the Arab nationalist regimes would be able to liberate Palestine militarily. And then, in 1970, Black September in Jordan, which was a war waged by the Jordanian army against Palestinian militants, which saw the expulsion of those armed groups to Lebanon. After being expelled from Jordan, Palestinian armed militants began increasing operations from Lebanese territory. This is when you see Israel turn its focus on Lebanon. Wanting to quell assaults and operations that come from its north, the Israelis began implementing a multi-pronged strategy. For one, they would attack targets where those assaults are suspected of emerging from. This would go hand in hand with indiscriminate bombing that doesn't differentiate between civilian and military targets. Second, intentional attacks on civilians in order to try to get them to turn against the Palestinian groups in order to stop the bombing. For instance, in 1974, the UN brokered a ceasefire called the Olive Truce to allow Lebanese farmers to harvest their olives, which of course Israel violated 3 days into the ceasefire with ground raids and aerial bombardments. And the third strategy the Israelis implemented in Lebanon was to court Lebanese Maronite collaborators, both in southern Lebanon and in Beirut. Already in the late 60s, the Israelis were arming the Phalange, or Kata'ib, who are a far-right Maronite party founded by Pierre Gemayel in 1936, literally in the image of the Nazi Party. In light of all of these contradictions and conditions, leftists in Lebanon formed what is known as the Lebanese National Movement in 1969. This would prove to be the greatest threat to the sectarian system to date. The Lebanese National Movement was an explicitly anti-sectarian, pluralistic movement with strong socialist currents that was also allied with the PLO and other Fedayeen groups. They understood that the Lebanese struggle against the sectarian oligarchical system was synonymous with the struggle for Palestinian liberation against Zionism. The Maronite elite, organized mostly within the Kata'ib party, hated all of this because they had basically everything to lose. So they resisted any change to the system, which first came through political maneuvers and then in the form of armed struggle. This is the backdrop of the civil war in Lebanon, which ignited in 1975. As future President Amin Gemayel stated, "We have tried to save institutions from any change. Although violence leads nowhere, it has helped us at least to save what could be saved. It was violence to conserve the system." Israel, for its part, had for years already been supporting the Phalange, hosting meetings with their leaders, training their soldiers, and sending them weapons. They prefer the continued domination of the sectarian Maronite Christian elite to anything else, not only because of their mutual antagonism to the Palestinians, but also because, in many ways, it mirrors their ethno-nationalist system a lot more than the pluralistic, leftist, and pro-Palestinian tendencies espoused by the Lebanese national movement. And so, when war broke out in Lebanon in 1975, and all the other fronts were functionally closed, Israel fully turned its sights onto Lebanon. They continued to fund the Kata'ib even after, or I guess I should say especially because, they were massacring Palestinians. And beyond that, already in 1976, Israel created what they called the Good Frontier in southern Lebanon, which is functionally a buffer zone. There, they installed Saad Haddad, an officer of the Lebanese army who defected to essentially serve as Israel's viceroy in South Lebanon. It was in this collaboration with Saad Haddad that the Israelis were finally able to live out the fantasy spelled out by Moshe Dayan 20 years earlier. 3 years into the war, in 1978, Israel invaded the country in what they called Operation Litani. The foreign minister of Israel at the time was none other than Moshe Dayan himself. To many, this is the start of the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon, a period that saw Haddad's forces commit numerous massacres in the south and solidify its hold in this newly created security belt. But Israel's presence in the rest of the country was short-lived. On October the 10th, the US, then under Carter, forced a ceasefire deal onto Israel, which then withdrew. But the occupation of the south remained, and so too did the resistance against it. That ceasefire went down exactly as the ones we're seeing today. Israel continued to bombard southern Lebanon, continued to arm and support their fascist Maronite Christian proxies across the country, and both the Lebanese and PLO acted with restraint. Eventually, this dynamic became unsustainable. So on July 15, 1981, the PLO began firing rockets into Israel, to which Israel responded, well, pretty much exactly as you'd imagine. They carpet-bombed populated areas in the south, attacked Tyre's port, and set fire to an oil refinery. Then again, on July 24, 1981, another ceasefire was brokered by the US. Again, Israel did not abide by it, and the PLO did. And then, and this is the major one, on June the 6th, 1982, the Israelis broke the ceasefire that had been in place for almost a year by invading Lebanon once again. Their claim to casus belli was the assassination attempt of the Israeli ambassador in the UK. But that was done by a group that was openly opposed to the PLO. And in fact, the Israelis, specifically the defense minister Ariel Sharon, had already been planning for the invasion months in advance. The 1982 invasion was massive, beyond anything the Israelis had done before, and in fact was the first time they crossed the Litani River. The Israelis besieged Beirut, and after bombarding the city, cutting off electricity and water, they managed to force onto the PLO a ceasefire. The PLO agreed to evacuate Beirut, the main stated aim of the Israeli invasion. But after that, the Israelis didn't withdraw, because another aim of their invasion was to ensure the election of Bashir Gemayel, the head of the Kata'ib party, as president of Lebanon. And so, on August the 23rd, 1982, on the back of Israeli tanks, Bashir Gemayel was elected president, a terrifying prospect for the Palestinians and the Lebanese left. But only 2 weeks later, Gemayel was assassinated in a massive car bomb outside of his headquarters. The assassin would later be identified as a Lebanese man, Habib Shartouni, a member of the SSNP. This killing was also a major blow to Israeli plans in Lebanon.
من الأمتار كانت الضربة قاصمة. كان كبير ضباط الموساد في لبنان السيد مناحم نافوت يحفر في الأنقاض كالمجنون.
He was digging under the debris like crazy.
كان مسؤولا عن العلاقات مع ميليشيا القوات اللبنانية يصرخ باتجاهي يهود لماذا لا تساعد في البحث؟
Calling me. He says, Ehud, why don't you help dig?
As a response to this, Christian fascist militias, under the auspices of the Israelis, who were in full control of those areas, committed the most notorious massacre of the war, the Sabra and Shatila massacre, in which over 2,000 civilians were killed, mostly Palestinian, who were completely defenseless because the armed militants who could have defended them were already expelled. Following this horrific massacre, resistance within Beirut against the Israeli occupation increased dramatically. This, alongside other pressures, led to Israel withdrawing from Beirut in September of that year. This was to be known as the very first time an Arab capital liberated itself from Israeli occupation through armed struggle.
وتتالى النهوض الشعبي في بيروت في مواجهة الاحتلال والانتصار بخروج القوات الإسرائيلية من بيروت، وهي تنادي في مكبرات الصوت طوال تلك الليلة: يا أهالي بيروت لا تطلقوا الرصاص علينا فنحن منسحبون صباحا، لا تطلقوا الرصاص علينا نحن منسحبون.
عاصمة احتلت وتحررت واحتضنت. القضية المركزية ما بعتقد في حدا عمل هالشيء. ما في عاصمة عربية عملت هالشيء. إنه بقيت الدافع حتى اللحظة الأخيرة.
Anyway, God, we've got so much to go through. It was in this period that the Americans created something called the Multinational Force, which entered Lebanon to enforce the ceasefire between the PLO and Israel. In September of the next year, the US would send 2,000 Marines into Lebanon, which worked to ensure the success of the Lebanese government under Amin Gemayel, Bashir's brother. And a little over a year later, 2 truck bombs targeted both the US Marine headquarters and the French battalion center, which led to huge casualties. For the former, for the bombing of the US Marine barracks, it would prove to be the single largest loss of life for American Marine forces since the Battle of Iwo Jima during World War II. The attack was claimed by a group nobody had even heard of at the time, a group that would later reveal itself as Hezbollah, the Party of God. In large part because of these attacks, the US and the rest of the multinational force were forced to leave Lebanon the following year. In 1985, Israel withdrew from Lebanon, but in reality, their buffer zone in the south remained, where Israeli soldiers and settlers could move freely back and forth. It was this occupation that led to the rise of Hezbollah, whose guerrilla fighters carried out continuous attacks and harassments of Israeli troops and their proxy militia. Other parties that contributed to the resistance against the occupation were the Communist Party, the SSNP, and the Amel movement. Israel's first major attempt to crush this new resistance was in 1993, where they tried to push them north of, you guessed it, the Litani River. Likewise, in 1996, in what the Israelis call Operation Grapes of Wrath, a 17-day assault on Lebanon attempted to push resistance groups beyond. Aside from that, the civil war in Lebanon would go through many manifestations, ultimately ending in 1990 with the signing of the Ta'if Accord. In reality, the core issues that ignited the war were never addressed, let alone the issues that arose during the 15 years of fighting. What started as a demand to end the sectarian system descended into sectarian chaos, and was ultimately resolved with some shifting of sectarian quotas and power divisions among the sectarian elite. The main losers of the war were the Palestinians, who would later be blamed for the entirety of the war and lost almost all of their political and military presence in the country. The occupation of the South would end in 2000, after resistance forces that emerged from the occupation made their continued presence untenable. But there was one territory that became a major sticking point: the occupied Shebaa farms, which the Israelis captured from Syria in 1967. I don't want to get into the debate of whether it's Lebanese territory or not. What's clear is that for Hezbollah, it is. As in, they've claimed it as occupied Lebanese territory. Some claim this was a move by Hezbollah to continue to validate its existence as an armed resistance group after the withdrawal of occupation forces from Lebanon. To Hezbollah, the Shebaa farms are occupied territory that makes that withdrawal incomplete, and thus began a 6-year, low-lying, cross-border conflict, which culminated in the 2006 July War. In this war, Israel again invades Lebanon, destroying infrastructure across the country, including the country's only international airport, oil depots, and vital bridges. Their demand: the total demilitarization of the entire region south of the Litani River. This war ends with a ceasefire deal brokered by the UN. The intervening period saw a relative calm between Lebanon and the State of Israel, the few hot moments I've listed in the timeline. This, however, was also a period in which Israeli jets, reconnaissance planes, and later drones repeatedly flew over our heads. A report found that between 2007 and 2022, Israel violated Lebanon's airspace 22,000 times. That's about 4 flights every single day. This was also a period of increased uprisings and violence in Palestine, specifically in Gaza. After the election of Hamas in 2006, Israel enacted a blockade on Gaza that basically remains to this day. Every few years, the Israelis would go in, bombard Gaza in what the Israelis called, I kid you not, mowing the lawn. At the same time, Israeli settlements in the West Bank increased dramatically. For Israel, the focus in this period was clearly with consolidating their hegemony over the territories they've occupied since 1967, but would still have time to make consistent threats against Hezbollah and Lebanon, such as every few months saying they will turn Lebanon back to the Stone Age. Hezbollah, for its part, also shifts away from being a purely armed resistance group to a player in the Lebanese political scene as well as regional affairs. Its largest departure, of course, being its decision to get involved in the Syrian civil war. That ultimately was the climate leading up to 2023. By the time the UN declared that because of the Israeli blockade, Gaza had become uninhabitable, Hamas's armed wing carried out the October 7 attacks, which has essentially ignited the regional war that we are still in this moment. Hezbollah responds the following day by opening up what they call the support front, by firing rockets into northern Israel. This fighting was relatively low-lying until September 2024, in which the Israelis dramatically escalated their aggression on Lebanon as a whole. They massacred civilians in their hundreds. They killed much of Hezbollah's top leadership, including Nasrallah himself, and targeted weapon depots belonging to the group. And on September 30, 2024, they invaded, again with the claimed intention of pushing Hezbollah back behind the Litani River. And on November 27 of 2024, they reached a ceasefire agreement, which stipulated that Hezbollah will disarm below the Litani River and tasks the Lebanese government with overseeing this disarmament. Israel, for its part, remained in 5 points in the south, and said it would withdraw if the Lebanese government fulfilled its obligations. In this ceasefire period, the UN estimates that the Israelis violated the ceasefire 15,000 times, while Hezbollah violated it once. These violations included near-daily airstrikes in the south, assassinations of key figures, demolitions of homes and villages, and ground raids by Israeli troops. And then, in the backdrop of the US-Israeli war on Iran, Hezbollah fired 6 rockets into Israel and instigated this new escalation we find ourselves in. There are, of course, many theories why they did this, based on their statements, but also their actions. They initially claimed it was to avenge the killing of Ali Khamenei, the now former supreme leader of Iran, and that it was also a response to the 15 months of daily Israeli bombardments, which was anything but a ceasefire. Some analyze that it was a way for them to break out of that dynamic, which saw Israel treat Lebanon as a free fire zone with zero deterrence from Hezbollah, the state, or the so-called international community. Others see it as a reckless maneuver to reclaim some legitimacy after the evident defeats it faced in 2024. Regardless, here we are now. The Israelis are in the country. They've invaded, and it's clear they want to stay. While working on this video, it was announced the Israelis want to create a yellow line in southern Lebanon, which is yet again another buffer zone. Many see this as a land grab, with a potential of Israeli settlements in southern Lebanon. Others see it as setting the stage for a large resource grab, not only of the fertile agricultural areas in the south, but also for the waters of the Litani River. I think, based on the full-scale demolitions of villages they capture, as well as the last 2 years of ecocide in the south, with, for example, Israel using white phosphorus munitions to poison the land, that the Israelis are trying to fulfill what Moshe Dayan stated in 1974, that we will make all life impossible in South Lebanon. It's clear that the Israelis are trying to ethnically cleanse the entire South. Even though, on April the 16th, we've entered a new ceasefire, the Israelis have not stopped their assaults in the South. They are wantonly destroying whole villages they are occupying, and making sure that life, let alone return, is impossible. With it comes the prospect of a prolonged displacement crisis, adding to the many, many crises afflicting Lebanon at the moment. This is the repeated theme of Israel's one-sided ceasefires, which we see parallels both historically and currently with its so-called ceasefire in Gaza. A ceasefire for the Israelis is time to recoup, plan, and establish new facts on the ground in the areas they've already conquered. I'll say it again, in the plainest of terms. Israel wants to destroy Lebanon. And I really can't buy a lot of the arguments that say that this will all end if Hezbollah disarms. There's also so much pushing the country towards civil war, especially with the current government being so focused on disarming Hezbollah as an end in itself, but also to deter Israeli aggression. A civil war in Lebanon is an outcome that many in Israel hope would happen.
Alone, זה נראה שאנחנו מובילים את מדינת לבנון לעבר מלחמת אזרחים, אולי זה לא רע לנו. שהממשלה הלבנונית תילחם בחיזבאללה.
זו השאיפה מההתחלה, לא בטוח כרגע שבמצבה הנוכחי יש לה את הכוח.
So, what are we in Lebanon supposed to do? What ways out of the situation are being proposed? And which options actually seem feasible for ending Israel's assault on Lebanon and ensuring the return of Lebanese people to the south? Part 2. Lebanon Today, Between Sovereignty and Resistance. Right now, Lebanon is at a major crossroads. Two main camps are forming, and neither are speaking to the other. The one camp, led by President Joseph Aoun and Prime Minister Nawaf Salam, is pursuing direct negotiations with the Israelis. They've committed themselves to the idea of monopolization of arms in the hands of the state and deferring anything to do with Israel to the so-called international community, because they've been so effective in the last 2 years, let alone last 15 years. The other camp, led predominantly by Hezbollah, is pursuing a course of armed struggle. Continuing on the path it set out 40-odd years ago, its main strategy is continued reliance on the Islamic Republic of Iran and the so-called axis of resistance. For the former, the sole problem is Hezbollah, and once it is disarmed, Israel will stop bombing us and will pull its troops out of the country. For the latter, resisting the invading Israeli army directly and continuing the military confrontation with Israel is their only recourse. And in a scary display of internal conflict, both are accusing the other of treason, of working on behalf of a foreign power. In effect, there is another layer to this, which again seemingly pits two mutually exclusive claims against each other. For those critical of the current government, they accuse them of sacrificing the south of the country for the sake of the rest of the country. For those critical of Hezbollah, they accuse them of sacrificing the rest of the country for the south. This, of course, has a corresponding sectarian aspect as well. On top of the deep polycrisis in Lebanon, especially the grueling economic collapse, which many claim to be one of the worst in a century, globally speaking, all of this is a toxic recipe for civil war. Now, I'm not about to sit here and give you simple answers about who is right and who is wrong. The questions I'm asking myself, that a lot of people in Lebanon are asking themselves, are way too complex given the current state of the region and the current world disorder. How do we stop Israel from bombing us? All of us. How do we get them out of Lebanon? How do we rein in the militant fascism and brazen expansionism that has become mainstream in Israeli society and politics? And actually, beyond that, how do we protect ourselves from the growing imperialist mania of the US empire? That last one is really scary, because apart from arming Israel to the teeth, the US, as of yet, hasn't gotten directly involved in Lebanon. But if history is any measure, it very well might at some point. The reason those questions are so complex for us is because for a lot of them, they basically have nothing to do with us. Israel has become a deeply sick society, with poll after poll showing continued majority support for the genocide in Gaza, the war on Iran, and the war on Lebanon. Settlers who are backed by the army are doing wholesale pogroms in the West Bank. They've gone completely mad, and there seems to be no internal or international mechanism to stop their expansionist and genocidal ambitions. I left Lebanon in 2021. There were, of course, many reasons, but the one that made me being there completely unsustainable was because I saw this war coming. Not only was I constantly terrified by the sound of Israeli warplanes overhead, but I could see the growing fascism in Israeli society for what it was, a lust for domination and expansion. Israel has never declared its borders, and it's been clear for a long time that they want to capture and take over Gaza and the West Bank. Then what? They say, okay, that's it, and start demilitarizing their society? No. The dominant trend in Israel, both politically and socially, is the need for an external enemy, for a constant warfare mentality. Otherwise, they'll turn on each other. This is all a recipe for violent expansionism with no internal breaks. And so I truly believe that what is happening today is that the fire that the Israelis lit in Gaza is now being spread to Lebanon. Where it'll stop is anyone's guess. How will it stop? Well, that's a very difficult question to answer. Now, those who are familiar with my channel know that I have been vocally critical of Hezbollah. I know very well that Hezbollah has played a role in all of this, that it has allied itself very closely with very reactionary and corrupt forces, both in Lebanon and in the region, that its military backing of the Assad regime not only made it very unpopular in the region, and was its monumental departure from its main stated goal of resisting Israel, but also may be the reason why its security apparatus was so seriously breached by the Israelis in the last 2 years. Or that its brand of distinctly sectarian forms of resistance and its foreign backing means that it has a major strategic weakness and is either unwilling or unable to really make its case to the rest of the country. There are a lot of very valid reasons why a lot of people in Lebanon do not trust Hezbollah. A key event that began this distrust, which is not as well known outside of Lebanon, was the brief civil war of May 2008, wherein Hezbollah and its allies turned their arms inwards against pro-government political parties, leading to weeks-long street battles reminiscent of the civil war. And so it's like, I know all of this, and I've communicated all of this, but at the moment, I'm incredibly torn, because I wonder about the utility of discussing any of this. I do think these are things that need serious discussion within the country, but I also think the situation at the moment is different, and our analysis needs to change too. That is, there is now a new occupation of the South, and we need to resist it. I don't think they will leave if Hezbollah is disarmed. I think the history demonstrates that very clearly. I think Gaza shows that very clearly. Even just listening to what the Israeli leaders themselves are saying makes that very clear. The fact is, Israel has been assaulting Lebanon since before Hezbollah existed. In fact, it is because of Israel's occupation that Hezbollah exists to begin with. And let's say, if they do successfully disarm the group, another one will form, because occupation breeds resistance. So honestly, at the moment, I'm very lost. The question, how do we stop the Israelis from bombing us, is one that needs to be answered right now, because actions need to be taken. And I, honestly, am gripped by this question every single day. And I know a lot of other people are too, but honestly, the most sober-minded people I know are just as perplexed as I am. In other words, I have very little trust in anybody who's speaking with confidence today. So, to really round out this section, I found this one essay that was published in L'Orient Le Jour, a Lebanese daily newspaper that I think is a very good example of this type of confidence. The title is Neutrality, a Viable Lifeline for Lebanon. I won't name the writer because I don't like getting personal. But not only does this essay reflect what some of the commentariat in Lebanon are saying, but also is a very rare and full elaboration on the main strategy being pursued by the Lebanese government today, which thus reveals both its logic and flaws. The essay begins with this short preamble, followed by a question. The imagery of our army evacuating posts in the south, while leaving behind villagers unwilling to abandon their homes in the face of the Hezbollah-Israeli conflict and Israeli incursions, raises an important question. What is the role of a state that cannot defend its borders from invasion and occupation? This question already poses our first contradiction. The government's plan is to replace Hezbollah in the south with the National Army, which will then protect civilians. But here, it's taken for granted that they won't. That as we saw last month, the army withdrew immediately after the Israelis started invading. So the whole argument that monopolizing violence in the arms of the state will bring order and protection, which is the foundation of the political path this government is going down, is a complete lie. The writer doesn't bother thinking that through. Rather, he answers his own question by stating, "The reality is much simpler. No army in the region can win at war with Israel. No proxy group can sell victory beyond survival. And Lebanon cannot function as a governable country, no matter how sophisticated its military capabilities, unless we dislodge ourselves entirely from regional war." So the role of the Lebanese state is to dislodge us from the geopolitics around us, which kind of sounds like dislodging us from the region. How does it do this? Do we try to do one of those meme things where we take Lebanon on the map and move it next to Iceland? No, but what the writer suggests is pretty much just as ridiculous. That requires adopting a policy too often misunderstood: neutrality. Neutrality is neither dismissing the Palestinian plight by throwing morals away, nor equating anything with Israeli crimes. It is demanding that Lebanon no longer pay an enormous price for hosting the Arab-Israeli conflict, or in this more recent round, the Iranian regime's survivability. So let's talk about that intro for a bit, because I think it's actually filled with historical inaccuracies, a kind of willful ignorance, and this very strange methodological framework that I can only describe as idealism. The phrase hosting the Arab-Israeli conflict is one I find particularly confusing. What does that mean? Where should it be hosted? How do we change hosts? The closest historical parallel to that is Black September, in which Jordan violently expelled Palestinian groups to Lebanon. After that, in a sense, Jordanians did stop paying the enormous price, but they simply pushed that cost onto Lebanon. Is that what the writer is suggesting? If so, where's this next Lebanon we can pass the buck onto? Also, the concept of the Arab-Israeli conflict, like it's a singular thing, really doesn't make any sense either, and it's the very language being used by Zionists. Framing this war as simply the Arab-Israeli conflict ignores Lebanon's particular history with the Zionist entity, and presents this war as revolving around flat Arab antagonism towards the State of Israel, rather than a continuous and carefully orchestrated expansion by the State of Israel. No army can win at war with Israel. Here, I might surprise you, because I actually kind of agree. The failure of Arab states and societies to develop different forms of engagement over the last decades is one of the reasons we are here today. That's kind of a big thesis of mine from my earlier video essay, Where Are the Arabs? But this war is also imposed on us. It's not our choice. People cannot afford to simply say, okay, we can't fight, because the alternative, as we've seen time and again, is surrender, occupation, and humiliation. Or rather, the alternative to war is war by other means. And beyond that, the south of Lebanon was liberated by armed resistance in 2000, which was done through a strategy of asymmetrical warfare. They didn't need to defeat the Israeli army, just like how the FLN in Algeria didn't need to defeat the French army, or the Viet Cong didn't need to defeat the American army. But so ultimately, the concept of a policy of neutrality, what does that mean? It not only implies that the agency is totally with us, but also that there is such a thing as neutrality in the face of a genocidal expansionist force, that if we say, we have no dog in this race, then the lion won't eat our face. But aside from that, what are the actual mechanisms of this neutrality? What does it look like? Are there any historical precedents to suggest that it's even possible? The writer's sole example is the 1960s, where he claims Lebanon was neutral and it worked. This, again, is purely ahistorical. At the time, Israel was preoccupied elsewhere, specifically against Egypt. This is also before the Palestinian Revolution of 1965, before the crushing of Arab nationalism in 1967, and before Black September of 1970. It was only after these developments that all other Arab states were pacified, that Palestinian militants were expelled from those collaborator regimes, and that Israel began to focus on Lebanon. The period the writer refers to as a period of neutrality was also a period of harsh repression against Palestinians in Lebanon, who up until the Cairo Agreement of 1969 were living under what amounts to martial law. This is a recurring theme throughout the region that the writer neglects to mention, that neutrality comes at an internal cost, with substantial portions of the population opposing Israel, with many wanting to fight it militarily. The only way for states to prevent this is to crack down through violent means. This is the nature of Egypt's authoritarian regime, as well as the Palestinian Authority and many others across the region, instead of employing violence against the aggressor, Israel. That violence is turned inward to repress those who would defend themselves, their homes, and their loved ones. Currently, that has been the stated ambition of the current government in Lebanon. The president, Joseph Aoun, was elected on a mandate of monopolizing arms in the hands of the state. However, it's been very clear that they can't do that the state is unable to really go through with it, because the potential for civil war is too great, especially with this being done while Israel continues to bombard us and occupy Lebanese land. So what does the writer propose? That Lebanon be occupied by a new international force that will replace UNIFIL. Where UNIFIL is unable to deliver, an alternative security arrangement should fill the void. Greater powers must support Lebanon in its desired transition away from permanent war. Without going into any detail about who those great powers are, he goes on to confidently declare that they will ensure Lebanon becomes neutral, and that neutrality will be Lebanon's shield, denying Israel a foothold on any single square meter of our geography. It remains our strongest defense. Why? Why do you believe this? Why does anyone believe this? This is exactly what I mean about idealism. It's not dealing with material realities at all. I mean, look at Syria, where it's very clear the Shara administration is operating from a place of neutrality. That didn't stop Israel from occupying more Syrian land, regularly bombing the country, and fomenting sectarian conflict. The writer's only historical argument is that the siege of Beirut in 1982 ended after the expulsion of the PLO and the introduction of the multinational force. But he literally ignores how actually Beirut was liberated by a popular armed resistance. That even after the Israelis withdrew and the multinational force stayed, that there was fierce resistance against them as well. That eventually they had to retreat. And that even after the Israelis withdrew from Beirut, they continued to occupy the south of Lebanon for another 18 years. Which itself only ended after fierce and consistent resistance. And that, very relevant to today, the 1982 invasion began as a violation by the Israelis of a 1981 ceasefire agreement. What can a new international force, which, let's be clear, is code for American or European, do for Lebanon in terms of guarantees when the Israelis violate international law day after day after day? The idea that what Lebanon needs is more imperialism is honestly absolutely ridiculous. After what we've seen about the so-called international community in Gaza, trusting them like this is wild and delusional. And again, it's so scary because this seems to be the calibration of the current Lebanese government. That is the delusion around the current direct talks between Lebanon and Israel, which assumes good faith in Israel and the US, where there clearly is none. And we literally have zero leverage. It simply does not make any sense. And it's asking so much of people who have no trust in the US or Israel or the so-called international community. I mean, why would they? Especially now with Trump and his complete disregard for international law. Like what? We're going to try working with Trump's Board of Peace? This is the viable alternative to Israeli occupation? This is one of the types of thinking that is really pushing Lebanon towards civil war. It totally neglects the South and its inhabitants, paints them at best as deluded by Hezbollah, or at worst complicit in dragging the rest of the country into a war. Are they not Lebanese? Do they not deserve sovereignty? Do they not deserve protection? Again, as I said, there are no easy answers to how any of this can be achieved. But what's 100% certain is this type of idealistic thinking, removed from reality and history, services no one, except to perpetuate the confusion of the current moment and the severe rifts that are tearing the very thin fabric of the Lebanese state apart. So, as I've said, I'm at a loss. The best I can do is dismiss the arguments that make no sense and pose better questions. But in terms of answers, I don't know. I think it's clear that the current government's strategy is doomed, incredibly unpopular, and really dangerous. I think resistance to occupation is necessary, and also literally a right under international law. I also think that Hezbollah is facing a lot of issues of legitimacy in the country, in many cases for very legitimate reasons. A small but illustrative example is that the writer of the essay I quoted in the last section, well, a big reason why he's so intensely anti-Hezbollah is because Hezbollah killed his dad. Like, a lot of Lebanese politics operates like this, and it's a result of being ruled over by a coalition of warlords for the last 50 years. But yes, there is one thing I can think of that I have heard some people say, that there needs to be space to form a national unity resistance, a popular resistance movement similar to the Lebanese national movement of the early 70s. One that combines a program of anti-sectarian social cohesion, a revolutionary political program to overcome the sectarian oligarchy plaguing the country, a progressive economic program that moves away from a financialized dependent oligarchical economy, and an armed wing, potentially of state or non-state forces, that can defend communities from Israeli aggression, and that also, very importantly, stands in solidarity with Palestinians in their struggle for liberation. This is, of course, another form of idealism, because how, who, when, with what money? Lebanon is, as it has been for a long time, a playground for imperialist powers, prime amongst them Israel. But again, this is a conclusion to an analysis that sees the fundamental contradictions, both within the Zionist colonization of Bilad al-Sham, but also the colonial, capitalist, and exclusionary core of the Lebanese entity. It's my own personal attempt to think positively. What can we, across the country, fight for and not just against? I think this is an essential thing missing so much in this moment of despair and humiliation. To say it one final time, Israel wants to destroy Lebanon. We must, all of us, resist that destruction by any means necessary. That means setting our priorities straight. It means unifying. It means forming communities based on common struggle. It means aiming towards liberation and not just sovereignty. It also means forming connections of solidarity with other communities across the region and across the world. The beast that is set upon Lebanon is global, and our only hope is global as well. The fire that started in Gaza is spreading now to Lebanon, but it will not stop there. It will consume us all unless it is put out. That means all of you as well. And now, a special message for my lovely patrons, Existential Puffin, Janet Robertson, Muhammad, and Jake Demarest Mays, as well as many more. If you want to hear your name read out at the end of my videos, or seen it written as text, then head out to my Patreon at patreon.com/AmonMac and become a member today. Not only will you help me make more videos like this, but you'll also be able to watch my videos ad-free, as well as other perks. So, thank you again for watching, and I'll see you all next time.